This episode is brought to you by Bumble. So, you want to find someone you're compatible with, specifically someone who's ready for a serious connection, totally open to having kids in the future, is a tall, rock-climbing Libra, and loves rom-coms with vegan pizzas on Tuesdays just as much as you do. Bumble knows that you know exactly what's right for you. So whatever it is you're looking for, Bumble's features can help you find it. Date now on Bumble.
I talk in the book not only about the factors behind the crimes in his story as the son of Sam, but I also talk about his story as a son of God in the last 35 years and some of the decisions that he's made that have played a big role in his change.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Bunny Hugs and Mental Health, a free safe space for people to share and learn from others' experiences with mental health and addictions. I'm Todd Rennebaum, a suicide attempt survivor and a recovering substance abuser. I've got another amazing episode here for you. It's with Dr. Michael Caparrelli, and he is an author. His latest book is Monster Mirror, 100 Hours with David Berkowitz, once known as Son of Sam, on mental health and evil phenomena. Yeah, Dr. Caparrelli spent 100 hours with the Son of Sam, wrote a book about it, and it's fascinating, and he's going to talk all about his findings and a whole bunch of stuff pertaining to that and mental health in America right now, and the world. Before we jump into that, I have a couple quick thank yous I want to give out. One is to Sticks and Doodles. They are a company in Regina, Saskatchewan. You can find them at sticksanddoodles.com. And also on Instagram at Sticks and Doodles. They make incredible engraved 3D signs and ornaments and artwork. Go check them out. They are amazing. They made this incredible sign that's hanging behind me. I want to thank Ellie and T from the Trauma Bonded podcast and Whit Missildine from This Is Actually Happening podcast. Thank you so much for everything you guys do. And to everyone at the Cornwall Alternative School in Regina, if you're looking for a new kind of charity to maybe donate to, please consider Cornwall Alternative School. You can go to their website, cornwallalternativeschool.com, and there you could be helping mental health, youth, education. It covers so many bases and so many things. I highly suggest you donate some money or in-kind goods to them. And speaking of donations, if you would like to buy me a coffee, I have a link in my show notes down there. And if you want to buy some merch, there's also a link for the podcast store down there as well. And if you feel like rating and reviewing and sharing the podcast, that would be amazing. So many people are getting so much from my guests. So that'd be amazing if you could, help other people by just letting them know that this podcast is even here. And last and certainly not least, I would like to give a huge thank you to Co-op. They've been sponsoring the podcast for about 8 months now or more. They are incredible. They're so appreciated. It's an incredible organization. They have hardware stores, pharmacies, grocery stores, gas stations, agricultural products, and you become a member of the co-op and you're a part owner in it. So that's incredible. They're all over Western Canada. You can find them on social media with all their handles in my show notes. Hey, don't forget that this episode is also on YouTube. You can go to my YouTube channel, Bunny Hugs and Mental Health, and you can see my face and my guest's face. Okay, but now back to the episode. So without further ado, I give you Dr. Michael Caparrelli.
I pastored a church for about 16 years in Providence, Rhode Island. I became a Christian actually behind bars. I was 17 years old, locked up in a juvenile jail, grew up in a home witnessing crime, visiting my dad in prison. And after becoming a Christian at 17, my whole life changed. And then pastored a church for 16 years, dealing with lots of inmates, mentally ill, the depressed, the addicted. And then about, maybe 5 or 6 years into my pastoring, I started to pursue my higher education. I already had the bachelor's and the master's and went for a PhD in behavioral science. Just wanted a better understanding of human behavior. The PhD program itself was about, 5 or 6 years full time, almost 130 credit hours, and then 2 years.
Probably really cheap too.
Yeah. I'm still paying on it. 2 years of research. Went out and did my own research for my dissertation. I did research on the recovery community and the impact of faith on people's recovery journey. Interviewed people in recovery across New England. So then completed my dissertation in 2020, I want to say. Wrote a few books on mental health. Resigned from pastoring, and lots of doors started opening for me to speak in prisons, schools, churches. Now I travel across the country. I'm in 18 states a year. I was in Florida last weekend. I'm leaving for Chicago tomorrow. Then I'm in Nome, Alaska. I speak in venues around the country, even around the world. I've been to Ireland, Italy, on mental health, but from a faith-based perspective. In 2021, I mailed David Berkowitz, inmate 78A 1976 at Shoregun Correctional Facility in Wallkill, New York. I mailed him a copy of a book called Dr. Jesus that I wrote on mental health from a Christian perspective. And he read that book rather quickly, wrote me back and said, "I'd love to meet you. I've been waiting for a guy like you to tell my story, somebody who is both a Christian but has a higher education in psychology to explain some of the psychological breakdowns behind the murders, also my journey behind bars the last 46 years." So that journey led to the book Monster Mirror that was just released in October on Amazon. It's my journey with David Berkowitz. It ranked number 1 on Amazon worldwide in the true crime category. Its first week of release, I think it ranked number 1 like 4 or 5 days in that first week, and has actually sold thousands of copies just in the last 5 months. I've been on national talk shows. I've done dozens of podcasts like this, and I believe it's a book that's very appropriate for the time in which we live, a time when there are 13 mass shootings a week, 13 school shootings, mall shootings in the United States. It's not happening in other countries as frequently as it's happening here. And my book, I believe, sheds light on some of the factors on why in America, my mother would say there must be something in the water. Well, I'm defining what it is in the water exactly in American culture that's helping contribute to this.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. Maybe I'll go back a bit, and we can keep going forward. But what was your father in prison for?
A bunch of things. I mean, he was involved in I'll use a line from The Sopranos. He was involved in an Italian-American subculture.
Okay.
My mother would tell me that he was in school and that we were going to visit him. That's the euphemism in Italian-American families. When your dad is in prison, you say dad's in school. Well, to this day, my dad, who's out now, but when we talk, here I am 46 and he's close to 70. And he goes, well, when I went to school, I'm like, Dad, you weren't in college. Like, we're beyond that now. All right. I'm not 6 anymore. I'm 46, but it's just what we do in Italian cultures. We come up with these euphemisms.
And has your dad been reformed? Does he live in a nice, healthy, clean?
Yeah, he's
well, I mean, you know what I mean.
You'd have to have your own separate podcast with him and ask him that question.
That's fair. That's fair. And so what was it that made you find faith? Was there like an aha moment? Like some people have I can't think of the word.
Yeah. Well, while I was behind bars, there was a correctional officer who was also a minister who used to come into the juvenile detention center with a guitar and a Bible. His name was Mike Krautman. He was from the streets. Wasn't your typical polished minister. He was very urban in his approach. And he sang a song that he wrote called City Streets. I was listening to the song. I felt a warm feeling in my body. My eyes began to fill with tears. And he explained to me that this was the presence of God. And I went back in my cell, read the Bible, and repented. Just said, Lord, please forgive me the way I've been living. My whole life changed. Mike Krautman, the guy who led me to Christ in the prison, that correctional officer, just died maybe 3 months ago. But he had me come and speak in the juvenile detention on multiple occasions to the teenagers. And yeah.
Were you kind of involved in that same culture?
Well, I was a kid. I was 17. I mean, what I did in particular was I had robbed a number of houses. I robbed a car that ended up being, it was an unmarked police car. Me and myself and two friends figured out it was a police car right away. As soon as we broke into it, it was a 1991 Toyota Camry or something like that. And when we broke into the car, we realized the equipment, this is a police car, but we just didn't have the fear back then. We just were reckless. So we took it anyway and did a string of robberies, and then ended up, surrounded by state police in Rhode Island, late night, like midnight, coming back from a home, and end up going to juvenile detention.
So how much time did you spend?
I didn't spend. I wasn't there long. Maybe a couple of months. It wasn't. Okay. Yeah, no. I had a good. My dad had a good lawyer. I had no background in that kind of behavior. My other friend, unfortunately, there were three of us. The other one, he did more time. He didn't have the same resources that I had at that point.
So you leave jail. It's not really prison, I guess, if you're only spending a couple months.
Yeah.
And then is that when you looked into faith further and started training to be a pastor?
Yeah, I had a guy actually that it was really the orchestration of God, because I met a guy that he was my employer. He hired me to sell vacuums, and he said to me, "Why don't you come to church?" And I said, "That's interesting. I just had church in juvenile detention." And he invited me to a church that was very similar. In fact, the people of the church knew the minister behind bars that reached out to me. It was quite the orchestration.
Kismet.
Yeah. So I said, God's trying to get my attention here. Went to that church, plugged into the community, was what we call discipled or mentored. And then I want to say maybe 3 or 4 years into my faith, I enrolled in Bible college, got my bachelor's in biblical theology, received training to be a pastor by the pastor that was shepherding that church, and got married, had kids, did all that, and started pastoring probably maybe 7 years or 8 years after my conversion, 25, 26 years old, somewhere around there, and grew that church, from 15 people to a few hundred, bought property, did the whole thing, and then resigned from that in 2019.
So what made you resign?
Well,
was it just because, you had all this other education and that was panning out? And
yeah, well, I had 2 heart attacks. I ended up having a small heart attack. Very stressful pastoring, especially in a more urban church, a church that's attracting people with addictions and mental health issues. Very stressful. So I ended up having a small heart attack, and then a year later I had the widowmaker. I was actually punching a bag in the gym. I went to go punch it, and my whole body shut down. I fell to the ground. It felt like an elephant on your chest, the old cliche. It was the widowmaker that kills 83% of the people. The main artery was clogged, and they put 4 stents in me. And I said, you know what? It was time to resign. I actually resigned in between the 2 heart attacks. The second heart attack came right after I resigned. It was like a month or 2 after. But then doors were opening. I got a job teaching at the college. I teach psychology, criminal psychology, abnormal psychology. I actually teach at 2 colleges right now. One is Christian college, the college I graduated from, and the other one is a secular community college. And I teach all these psych courses. I do that Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays. And then my weekends are typically when I travel. I'll be in Chicago this weekend. I was in Florida last weekend. I'll be in Nome, Alaska after that. I'm in 18 states a year. It's just constant speaking on the mental health issues because we're in a mental health crisis as a country.
Yeah, maybe even as a planet after COVID.
Sure.
I mean, we're the province I'm in Saskatchewan here. It's we're breaking records all the time with suicides and overdoses. And yeah, I don't know what's going on, but the world is hurting right now.
Most definitely.
Do you think that there is a direct connection between people maybe losing faith and mental health and addiction?
Most definitely. Some of this mental health crisis, or a good portion of it, is an existential crisis. We're losing touch with meaning. What is my purpose in life? Why am I here? What is the meaning behind life in general? What's the point? That existential crisis is a big contributing factor. It was a contributing factor to David Berkowitz's crimes. I talk about nihilism, its effects on his psyche, and how it,
What's nihilism?
nihilism is a philosophy that says everything is nothing. Everything is meaningless. There's really no meaning to life. Nietzsche, the philosopher, was really one of the famous. Some argue that it wasn't really what he believed, but whatever. He's the face, the poster child behind nihilism. So I believe the existential crisis is a big part of it. We don't really know what we believe anymore. And when, we're existential beings, we need a point, we need a reason, we need a purpose. And I would also argue that the social fabric of our society is torn apart. You don't really see mental health crises, and you don't see violence, senseless violence. I won't say violence because there is religious motivated violence like in the Middle East, but you don't see this random, senseless kind of violence like serial killings, school shootings in your more collectivist nations, countries where the community ties are very strong. America is very individualistic. Now, it's ironic because we're also very extrovert, so you'd think that we have social ties, but extrovert doesn't necessarily mean strong social ties. So I think there's a social crisis and there's an existential crisis and a moral crisis. I think a lot of that contributes to the mental health crisis, but that's just a part of it. I deal with 9 factors in my book with David Berkowitz, 9 pieces that contributed to his own breakdown and contribute to our own breakdown.
Before we get into Berkowitz, I just got one more question about this. What do you feel that maybe some of the gun laws are also a contributor?
Sure. I mean, we know from the data that when people have a gun at their fingertips, attitudes change. People can say, well, guns don't kill people, people kill people. I agree. I definitely agree. I'm not this, ultra leftist when it comes to this issue. I'm somewhere in the middle. I definitely think that taking away guns can also be taking them away from the good guys. So I don't want to be misunderstood. But I also I'm a man of data, and I know that having a weapon and maybe not being mentally stable is not a good recipe. Not maybe, definitely. And we know from the data that guns can change people's attitudes and kind of make them stick their chest out a little bit more.
Right. Yeah, and then you throw in, like I said, mental health issues, and there's more impulsivity, and you become emotionally dysregulated quicker, and so 2021, David Berkowitz reached out to you. Is that what you said?
I reached out to him in 2021. I mailed him a copy of my book. He read it, reached back out to me in 2021. And then we met early 2022. We met, it was my first visit in early 2022, and it was one of 34 visits, 34 sessions, about 3 hours a session, total of 100 hours. The longest analysis ever done on David Berkowitz. The last time there was an analysis was in the 80s. It was 50 hours by a criminologist by the name of David Abrahamson. I doubled that time.
And I'm assuming, like most people change over time. And I'm assuming David Berkowitz is obviously has grown as a person. So, there's a whole way more chapters to add to his life than what the guy did in the 80s, the criminologist. He obviously had found faith. How early in his... Well, actually, he went to prison in 76, is that right?
77.
77, okay. So what year or how long was he in prison before he started to find faith and religion?
1988. It was an inmate that was a few years younger by the name of Rick, a Latino man, approached David in the prison yard. David would go for walks. He loves walking outdoors. He gets maybe an hour and a half at night. And while he was walking on a cold evening, I want to say it was January 88, Rick approached him, gave him a Bible, a Gideon Bible, shared the faith with him. And David was resistant for a little while, but Rick would continue to meet him outside in the prison yard and befriend him. And then at one point, David went back to his cell, actually started reading the Bible, and got on his knees and started crying in his cell, asked God to forgive him. And the next day, he told Rick the story. Rick introduced him to the community of believers. And I talk in the book not only about the factors behind the crimes in his story as the son of Sam, but I also talk about his story as a son of God in the last 35 years and some of the decisions that he's made that have played a big role in his change. I'd have to disagree with you respectfully that most people change. I would argue that most people don't. Most people are pretty stuck in life. It's just we're creatures of habit. The best predictor of human behavior is if you want to predict what someone's going to do, just look at what they did because they're probably going to repeat what they did. You want to develop a good intuition, develop a good memory, because if you remember what someone did, you can predict intuitively what they're going to do. Most people are creatures of habit. They don't get out of their own way. It takes some real effort, lots of intentionality to change. And David put a lot of work in over the last 35 years. Is he perfect? No. Should he be released from prison? Nope. He doesn't even want to be released. He's 71 now. But has there been tremendous growth? I highlight that in the book. And my answer to that is yes.
So what was this Rick person? What was he in prison for?
The inmate that introduced David to the faith? I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't know Rick's story.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I know I think he's out now. David's lost touch with him because inmates are not allowed to, once they leave, get back in contact with the inmates that are in the prison. So we don't really know where Rick is. We haven't really heard from Rick. It'd be interesting to hear, Rick. If you're out there, Rick, it'd be interesting to hear from you.
So what was Berkowitz doing between being convicted and fighting faith in 88? Was he just kind of like you were saying, just the same patterns, the same thought patterns, and just kind of just dark, hanging out in prison?
Yeah, very dark. A lot of prison fights. He was in the hole for about 60 days, beat up another inmate viciously, just troubled in every way, angry, depressed, not easy to get along with, isolated. I mean, all the typical behaviors that were on when he was on the streets. In fact, he actually had his neck slashed in 79 from here to his Adam's apple and almost killed him. It was like 60 stitches or something like that by another inmate that was trying to make a name for himself. David actually became a star overnight in prison because he refused to snitch on the guy who cut him, which in the eyes of other inmates, you're considered a stand-up guy if you keep your mouth shut. So he was just kind of part of that whole, element of sociopathic, psychopathic inmates until 88.
Has he ever been diagnosed with psychopathy or anything?
It's interesting when they were evaluating David, during his sentencing. He never went to trial because he ended up pleading guilty. You had one doctor, I believe by the name of Daniel Schwartz, who said he was schizophrenic. And then you had Abrahamson, who said not schizophrenic. He's very calculating. He's not psychotic. He's psychopathic with psychotic breaks. So you've got, one psychiatrist who was more erring on the side of him being psychopathic, very aware of what he was doing, and another one erring on the side of him being psychotic. I would say, looking back at David's behavior, he was more psychopathic than psychotic. There definitely was psychotic breaks, but he was calculating. He was lacking in empathy. He was planning and the murders were very precipitated by a whole bunch of factors. Premeditated, no doubt. I don't see him as a true schizophrenic. I see him more as someone who was psychopathic.
Yeah. And from doing the podcast, I've talked to a few people that have cluster B personality disorders, including
antisocial
psychopathy.
Well, psychopathy is not listed in the DSM. It's not a clinical disorder. It's more.
I see.
It's more of a cultural construct, but it is predicated upon antisocial personality disorder. That's listed in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. But it's not exactly. Not all antisocials are to the level of a psychopath killing people, but they're definitely, there's no deference to authority. They disregard the norms, the rules, exploit people in their weaknesses, predatory, etc.
Right. Lack of empathy. But like all other disorders, it could be treated. And, once it's treated, it's like, so I'm in recovery of addiction. It's like, It's also a disorder, and it can be treated, but you have to also do a lot of maintenance and work to keep it at bay. You're never cured of it. So would you consider that having David Berkowitz find faith and connection, and he's got connections with other humans now because of the faith, that perhaps that's kind of treated his antisocial behavior and his psychopathy?
He's actually, in my opinion, a marvel, because the data shows that antisocials do not do well in therapy. They make very little progress. The cancel culture says they should just die. There's no hope for those antisocials, so the psychopaths. But it's true. I mean, most antisocials are pretty, it's a pretty stable personality disorder, meaning it's consistent behavior over a period of time. You don't see change very often.
Bunny Hugs and Mental Health is supported by Co-op. I've been a member of my local co-op, Sherwood Co-op, for about 20 years. If you live in Western Canada, especially the prairies, or spent any time here, you've probably fueled up or bought groceries at a co-op. You might even have a co-op number, or 2, or 3. You know if you know. But co-op is not just a gas bar or grocery store. Although co-op is those things too, it's a different kind of business. Co-op members are owners, and success is shared with everyone. Your co-op doesn't benefit one person or one corporation. Your co-op was built for everyone. Your co-op was built for your community. Learn more about co-op and find a location near you at co-op.crs. Hey everybody, I want to tell you about a really great business called Sticks and Doodles. It's an incredibly passionate business, crafting wood signs, plaques, ornaments, and other products for all types of occasions. They have an amazing team. The owners are Kyle and Danelle Moffat. They are incredible. Please check them out at sticksanddoodles.com or Sticks and Doodles on Instagram.
So David's story is very unique the last 35 years since 1988. I'll describe some of that in my book, Monster Mirror, that this man can now demonstrate empathy. I've seen it. Can have a real good regulation over his impulses. Now, I get my critics that say, how do you know David's not fooling you? Well, I've sat with them 100 hours. My criminal psychology background is not from watching Criminal Minds at home on a Friday night. It's from, everybody's an expert now on the subject because you got all these YouTube videos and TV shows, but there's a big difference between pop psychology and the actual thing that you practice and you learn when you get a higher education. I don't mean to sound arrogant. It's just you get a lot of critics that really don't know what they're talking about. Right. When you say, well, David's a jailhouse conversion, well, jailhouse conversions don't last 35 years. I've worked with inmates. They usually last about 6 months before a parole hearing to get out. David's not trying to get out. And when you sit with someone that long, you don't just see their actions. People say actions is the best litmus test of someone's character. It's certainly better than speech. But actions also can be contrived. People can put on an act. Shakespeare said the world is a stage. People are acting all the time. But what's hard to fake is not actions, but reactions. And I got a chance for 100 hours to watch David's reactions. Reactions are actions in real time, unscripted, visceral. A man's caught by surprise, off guard. I've seen him angry. I walked into a session. I describe it in chapter 2 of the book Monster Mirror. He had a verbal conflict with another inmate, and I watch how he handles anger. And that was for 3 hours. And I detail that in the book, and it flies in the face of how a psychopath handles anger. I watch him exhibit empathy, relationships with victims. In fact, one particular guy he shot survived. That guy's name is Carl Denaro. Carl and I went into the prison together and visited David Berkowitz.
Was that his first time doing that?
Second time. Carl had visited him, I want to say, a year or two prior. And I watched David make a confession to him and look him straight in the face and demonstrate great regret and sorrow. And I watched Carl Denaro, who's a very virtuous guy. I watched him forgive David Berkowitz. Carl has his own take on the story. You can get his book. It's called The Son of Sam and Me. It's on Amazon. He's got a unique take on the story. I would even recommend maybe getting a hold of him for this podcast. I don't really want to comment too much on his angle on it, but
Sure.
but Carl, and I've seen David. My point, I've seen David in action, reactions that to me indicate a man that's no longer psychopathic. Or if he is, if you want to say he's psychopathic because it's in the brain or it's biological, genetic, then there's some basis to that. Like there's a particular gene known as the LMAOA gene that's often associated with people with psychopathy. He may have psychopathy, but psychopathy doesn't have him. Let me say it that way.
Right. So it's kind of like dormant in him.
Mm-hmm.
And then that brings up the whole thing of like nature versus nurture and all that kind of stuff. So, which I guess, I mean, he could have been born with this disposition that's kind of sleeping in him until some kind of nurture moment or trauma then triggers that. Did he have trauma growing up as a child?
Well, who didn't?
Well, yeah,
right.
Right.
No, there were some very unique factors in his childhood growing up in New York City that contributed to the making of the Son of Sam. We're careful to talk about this because we don't want to make excuses. David will be the first to tell you that the biggest factor in him becoming the Son of Sam was his own choices. You don't just make choices. Choices make you. So choices were the biggest part of it. But there's also choices of other people and their sins against you that also played a role in the cultivation of resentment from being shamed very greatly as a child, very hyperactive in school, ADD back in the 60s, early 60s. Nobody knew anything about that. You're just a bad kid. Teachers would take his desk, put it in the middle of the class, and say to the rest of the class, this is where the bad boys sit. David would sweat bullets going to school. He did not want to go to school, but he would go anyway and just be shamed continually, fist fights with teachers. He was picked on, bullied in different scenarios, and was the bully in other scenarios. Had some head trauma. I talk about that in the book.
Oh, interesting.
2 different times. I actually interviewed Dr. Daniel Amen, who's a brain expert. He's a shrink to the celebrities, very well-known guy. He's got millions of followers. He wrote a blurb on the cover of my book, Dr. Daniel Amen, A-M-E-N, or Amen. I interview him in the book on head trauma and how it contributes to damage in the frontal lobe, lack of regulation of impulses, and other. So I deal with the story from social perspective, biological perspective, existential perspective, emotional perspective, rational, cognitive distortions that were going on in his mind. I mean, I cover the bases pretty well in Monster Mirror.
And I appreciate the fact that you can have empathy for David Berkowitz, but you also know that these were decisions, and there is a moral issue in society that he has to do his time, and it's and I hear that all the time in sentencing for criminals, and it's like the lawyers put on this big sob story of how the person grew up, which is, again, I have empathy for those people and for the horrible lives they had, but at the same time it's like, well, you have to take accountability and you have to do the time because it's just the way it is. I'm sorry, but
every person that has David's story, and some people even have worse circumstances, don't become the Son of Sam. So obviously decision points, choices are the most pivotal aspect of what we become in life.
Right. And that's something, it was a hard pill to swallow for me when I was in addiction treatment. It was, counselors and other people were very empathetic, but at the same time, you didn't get empathy until you took accountability for the shit you did. It's like, okay, this is, and it comes full circle. It's, as someone in that position, not that I'm comparing myself to the Son of Sam, but it is very, it is a very kind of almost a spiritual moment. So I could see how healing that would be for him to be able to take accountability for something that horrible and to then just be so grateful.
Most definitely.
So what do you recommend for society? other than more faith, or like you said, America, more specifically because of all the disconnect and all the mass shootings and things.
Well, I mean, from an existential perspective, what you believe matters. Ideas have consequences. And you might want to take a step back and evaluate what it is you believe, because your beliefs are like anchors. They kind of, ground the boat when the storm comes. If you have no beliefs, I mean, to believe in anything or to believe in nothing is to fall for anything. You're more susceptible to the seductions of the culture, whether the seduction is substance abuse, whether it's recruitment into a gang, whether it's some abusive relationship, or whether it's some cockamamie idea that you should go out and shoot somebody. If you believe in nothing, then you'll fall for anything. So I think an existential journey is most important, really evaluating what it is you believe. And I also would push social integration, unique community. We just cannot survive without a tribe. We're social creatures. Even the most introverted listener on this podcast is still social. You might not need as much social contact as the extrovert, but you still are a social creature. It's part of your fundamental makeup. We know from the data, University of Japan, which is an interesting school to conduct this research, because the Japanese are very quiet, and Japan is dealing with the level of isolation that can be scary. University of Japan did a study on rodents. They took a community of rodents, isolated a sample, 15 days, let's say, and then they returned the isolated rodents back to its community. And at the point of reentry, the isolated rodents attacked physically the rodents from their community. Why did that happen? When we're isolated, adrenaline goes up. We become more aggressive, more combative. And oxytocin goes down. Oxytocin is probably the closest link biologically to empathy. It's what makes us feel close to people. So we become isolated, more aggressive, less empathetic. Kind of see that play out in 2020. It was a very contentious year. Now, you could say it was Donald Trump or George Floyd or race or politics, but underneath it all, you had a country that was very isolated, quarantined. And, it's no shock to me that if you were on social media during that time, or even if you went out in the streets of certain cities, there were riots and lots of aggression, because the more isolated we are, we just don't do well. We need community. We need it. I think we know this intuitively. If you've ever gone to a party with a friend, maybe in your past, and your friend is like arguing with everybody at the party, one of the funny things you'll say is, "I'm sorry about my friend. He doesn't get out much." Well, right. Why do we say he doesn't get out much? Where does that line come from? It comes from this gut knowledge, intuition, that when people are isolated, they don't get out much. They lose social grace. They lose the ability to relate and bond with other people. They're not socialized. That was certainly David Berkowitz's situation for a long time. And what's ironic is he grew up in a very populated place. New York City is the most populated place probably in the world. And he was with people all the time. But there's a big difference between being with people and bonding with people. David knew how to be with people. He didn't know how to bond with people. He was very lonely in the crowd. So if I'm talking to those right now that are having a tough time mentally, existential, you need to evaluate your beliefs. Social, you need a community of people that are around you. Cognitively, those people are going to call into dispute some of your crazy ways of thinking, what we call in the recovery community in the halls of AA, stinking thinking. That stinking thinking has to be confronted, because the way we see things, our beliefs, as right as we may think we are, we need a second set of eyes. We need the counsel of other people to challenge our thought processes, because we don't get it right. And if we think we can help ourselves, well, there's an old Indian adage that says, if you want a definition for water, don't ask a fish. And the point is, the fish is immersed in its own circumstance. It can't define what it's immersed in. And you can't define what's getting at you. You're immersed in yourself. You need a counter perspective to challenge some of your crazy thinking. So it's a multiple domains that we have to work on. And one is existential, the other one is social, the other one is cognitive. Probably, in my opinion, the most important is the spiritual. We need a higher power.
Wow. That was a great answer.
Well, I teach this stuff in the college.
I always think back to Gabor Mate's thing is like the opposite of addiction is connection. And then, that's, yeah. And even in AA, it's amazing how the people that came up with AA, I mean, I don't think they were psychologists, but they were probably forms of early psychologists and they didn't even know it. And just the 12 steps, just how basically, psychologists are using that same kind of makeup today. And, one of the biggest steps is finding a sponsor, which is connection and having, like you said, like checks and balances for people to like, hey, you're stinking thinking, come on, let's go for a coffee. Let's get out of here. You're spiraling again. So yeah, it's amazing how kind of everyone agrees. It's in different wording maybe, but yeah, it's true. And I like that you said too, like you can be in a crowd, it'd still be isolating. I mean, I've been there.
So you're alone, or I'm sorry, you're with a group of people, or maybe someone's home, a party, maybe you're going out to eat with a few friends, and yet you're like, man, I still feel so disconnected. Like, what is going on here? Why am I so lonely? One of the things that separates you from people is your secrets. Your secrets put great distance between you and the people around you. That was David's story. He had a lot of sidekicks, believe it or not. A lot of sidekicks. He was played on baseball teams as a kid. He was in the Army. He had for 3 years. So a lot of comrades. A lot of sidekicks, but he had more secrets than sidekicks. And those secrets put distance between him and the people that are around him. So, when we talk social, we talk knowing people and being known, to know and to be known, sharing and hearing, the reciprocity of relationship, quid pro quo, something give, something take. If that's not happening, then, I mean, you have 5,000 friends on Facebook. You don't have 5,000 friends. I mean, it's connection is so much more than just being in the company or the proximity of people.
That's right. Yeah. And there's another AAism, or at least I heard it in AA, was secrets make us sick.
You're only as sick as your secrets. That's right.
You're talking about finding community, especially for young people and stuff. And that can also be dangerous at times so when I guess when younger people are vulnerable, they don't feel like they're part of a pack, and then they start finding people, sometimes it's extremism, right? And then you become vulnerable to be preyed upon. And I don't know what my point was, but
well, if you don't have the existential in place, you don't know what you believe, and you don't have a good value system that you've come up with between you and your God. Maybe it was your upbringing, but if there's no real strong existential core, and now all of a sudden you meet a group of people, and let's say they're a cult or some kind of gang, or even just toxic people that you meet in the workplace, you're more likely to be roped into some very unhealthy relationships. I actually wrote a book about this called The Ox and the Ass. In Bible days, they would say an unequal yoke is when you take an ox, a very hardworking animal, you yoke it with an ass, a very stubborn, lazy animal. Now, a yoke is what connects two animals to do work together. And now the ox can't go forward. He's only going in circles because of the dead weight. That's a picture of a lot of dysfunctional relationships. You're just going in circles. But you're probably going to fall into that social trap easier. You're more susceptible to toxic relationships when you don't have a solid, healthy belief system. Because my belief system is going to let me know right away. My value system, what I believe, what I value. You and I, we don't click. Or you and I, we have a kindred spirit. There's something here that works. I'm going to know that right away. But if I'm just like an empty slate, I don't know what I believe, and I meet a crowd of people and they love bomb, they make me feel real good about who I am, all of a sudden I'm going along to get along, and it could be real destructive.
So the title of your book, Monster in the Mirror. Monster Mirror. Oh, I knew I was going to screw it up. maybe explain the mirror part, because when you with a mirror, there's reflection. So
Yeah.
I find that kind of intriguing.
I figured meeting David Berkowitz and hearing his story back in the 70s, I was going to hear the story of a monster. I was shocked to find out that the themes I gathered in my data, 9 themes, were not exclusive themes. They weren't themes that only relate to psychopaths, but they very much reflected my own struggles. And I realized that there was a potential psychopath. I don't want to say a psychopath, but a potential psychopath in everybody. And that this monster was actually a mirror. Now, you might not think I'm not psychopathic, but listen, maybe not now. I'm not saying that you're tomorrow capable of doing what David did. But spend 6 months brooding over every resentment you have. Spend 6 months brooding over your parents' abuse, your ex-husband or ex-wife's treatment of you, how unfairly you're treated at work. Just mull over that for 6 months. Spend 6 months isolating, pulling away from community. People are too much trouble. I just want to be by myself. Spend 6 months justifying every wrong thing you do. You read Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, classic Russian novel from the late 1800s, and you see how this man evolves into a monster. I don't think that psychopaths are other people. I don't think that there's any other people. I think it's just us, and that there's no, it's human nature. It's the nature of the Homo sapien that any one of us could evolve over time, not suddenly, but subtly evolve into a creature that we would never think we'd become. So Monster Mirror is all about not just David Berkowitz, but it's a glimpse into our own souls.
Yeah, I often wonder if I had made just one more bad decision, or I had met just one more toxic person, just how much further that could have taken me to the next bad decision, the next Absolutely. Bad person, the next, we're all potential monsters, but we're also all potentially amazing people too. And
Oswald Chambers said it this way. He said Oswald Chambers was a classic Christian writer from the early 1900s. In every man, there is a potential hero and a potential skunk.
And do you think, do you have hope? Well, I guess you probably do have hope, but do you think the American culture can change and be more like your dream America is?
Well, it starts with the individual. I don't know that there's any usefulness in trying to change the world. The better approach is changing my world. What's in front of me.
No.
I think that sometimes
I'm liking this.
Yeah, well, I think sometimes we get caught up in this macro kind of perspective, and it's sort of grandiose, maybe even narcissistic, that we want to, change the world. But that's not. There's no utilitarian significance in that. The better thing is the man in the mirror, and if I can reach the individual, each reader that's reading this book, then that's one step closer towards the revolution of a culture.
I agree 100%. I actually have a second episode a week that I do I don't do with a guest. It's with a co-host, and we look at articles and stuff. But anyway, we always sign out our episode. If you change yourself, you change the world.
There you go.
And I love that you said that. And even so I went through a very vulnerable time just before I got sober. And it's kind of when I first started doing some mental health advocating and stuff, was after a suicide attempt and whatnot. And I was starting rallies and holding up signs and going to the government buildings and shouting and, doing all that stuff. And it felt good at the time, but I ultimately, as the days afterwards, I remember thinking this, I'm not doing anything. I just feel like I'm just letting out my aggression. Then eventually I did become sober, and then I started doing talks and stuff. And then the treatment center that I was working at hired me. And one of my coworkers said, isn't that amazing, Todd? You went from trying to change the world to working with people, boots on the ground, one-on-one with clients. And you're actually making change. And I was like, yes, that's that's this feeling I'm having, because I would go home feeling so, that existential moment. It was like, I think this is what my purpose is. I think this is what gives me purpose. Yeah. So yeah, again, I love that you had said that it really starts with the individual, and just how powerful it is to work one-on-one with people as opposed to trying to change
absolutely
an entire planet at once.
So I'm hoping if you read Monster Mirror, if you go on Amazon and you make the purchase, like I said, it ranked #1 in true crime in October. You can go buy it now. It's been reduced to a price a few dollars cheaper than its listed price. I think it's like $16 now or something like that. I'm hoping that book is going to be a book of hope. I'm a peddler of hope. It's going to bring hope and insight into your own madness and how to come out of that madness. I'm believing it's going to light up some very dark places. Readers that are going to buy this book and say, if David Berkowitz, the worst possible person, can experience this kind of change, then maybe there's hope for me too. And if readers are interested, you can find me on Facebook. I put up teachings on mental health from a faith perspective all the time on Facebook. Just look up Mike Caparrelli, look up my name. You'll see my picture right away. I'm an active presence on Facebook and Instagram. You can also go to my website, Unmuted, which is about giving victims of trauma their voices back, unmuted.app, APP. And you can buy any one of my 5 books on Amazon or Barnes & Noble.
Thank you so much for that. It's an incredible story, and you just, in general, you have a really great story, and I just love that you are sharing knowledge and teaching people, and just an all-around cool dude. So thank you, Dr. Caparrelli. You can find all his books on Amazon, and he's on Facebook and stuff, so I will put links in the show notes for that as well. And hey, if you're into books, I've written a children's book. It's called Sometimes Daddy Cries. It's about a kid who's watching his dad go through depression. It has been out for a few years. It gets really great reviews and ratings from parents and professionals. So that's also on Amazon. That's Sometimes Daddy Cries by Todd Rennebaum. And if you are looking for a guest speaker for your corporation, your school, whatever kind of event you're throwing, feel free to reach out to me at bunnyhugspodcast@gmail.com. I love doing them, and I can do them in person or virtually or whatever. Just reach out to me and we'll get that ball rolling. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. I've got more great episodes coming up, so stay tuned. And please remember to make your beds and take your meds. Bye.